is going to be on what I would call original and traditional Buddhism. And it's going to be on the distinction between these two things, what we call original Buddhism, and then the development from that original Buddhism of what we might call traditional Buddhism. And original Buddhism, for me, is a very simple thing. Original Buddhism is essentially the experience that the Buddha had on his night of awakening, roughly 2,500 years ago. That is essentially what original Buddhism is. And everything else, pretty much, is traditional Buddhism. But more precisely, what we mean by traditional Buddhism is the type of Buddhism that you find in any particular time, at any particular place, wherever you go in the world. That is what I would call traditional Buddhism. And of course, this traditional Buddhism includes all those various types of Buddhism that you find in the various countries. And the reason why we get this traditional Buddhism is for two reasons. And the first thing is that over time, the original Buddhism of the Buddha tends to change. This is just the nature of how things are, nature of impermanence. That's the first reason. Change just happens all by itself pretty much. And the second reason is that as Buddhism spreads to different countries, different cultures, different places, it tends to take on some of the flavor of that culture wherever it goes. And by doing that, it becomes, gradually it changes, and it's no longer exactly what it was originally when the whole thing started out at the time of the Buddha, if you like. And this is, for me, is a very important point to actually reflect on the fact that Buddhism changes, that it takes on some of the connotations and colors and the ways of doing things of any particular country. Because what that means, the reason why that happens is, of course, that that country's culture exerts an influence on Buddhism. And as Buddhism accepts some of the standards of that particular country, it adapts to that culture and it becomes more viable in that particular society. If it didn't adapt, if it was too rigid, it would probably be much less viable in that particular society. And this is important for us also here in Australia, or indeed anywhere in the world, because unless there is some sense of adaptation, some sense of falling in line with the view of Australian society or the society anywhere, I think that will weaken Buddhism in the long run. It won't strengthen it because it will become much more difficult for it to be integrated into that society into which it has arrived. So that is those two things. So, and of course, this becomes very important for us because we have to decide if we are going to adapt Buddhism to Australian society. We have to decide, well, what is the right way of doing this? What sort of things can we adapt? What are the things we can't? Because there are certain things which are so fundamental to the Buddhist way of doing things that if you start adapting them, you're actually throwing out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. You're losing what Buddhism really is about. And of course that would be a terrible thing to do. We can't afford to do that. And that is where the idea of original Buddhism comes back in. We have to know what it was that the Buddha actually taught very clearly, and then we can make a choice as to those things that can be adapted and those things which can't. So this is the significance and the importance of understanding the difference between original and traditional Buddhism. And I will start off just talking very briefly about original Buddhism, what that actually means for me. And as I said before, basically original Buddhism is what happened to the Buddha on his night of awakening. That insight, that understanding he had at that time, that is what original Buddhism essentially is all about. So what happened after that? What happened after that is that, of course, the Buddha started teaching, and in his teaching career he gave a large number of discourses and talks to the monks, to the nuns, to the laymen, to the laywomen, the four assemblies of Buddhism. And those, of course, are then what came to be understood as the original Buddhism, because that was directly from the word of the Buddha, and it was a consequence of his enlightenment experience. So that is what we have. That is essentially what original Buddhism is. But of course, it's much more complicated than that, because it's very hard. We live 2,500 years after the Buddha. Sometimes it's very difficult for us to know what exactly is the word of the Buddha. You start off with something like the Pali scriptures, the famous scriptures that have survived for a long time. And you look at those and you realize that they are enormous. They are literally, if you take everything into account, there are hundreds and hundreds of volumes of Pali scriptures. Not surely the Buddha couldn't have said all those things, because if he said all that, he would have been speaking non-stop and still wouldn't have been able to say all those things that you find in those scriptures. And of course, if you go to the other countries, like you see the Chinese canon, which is preserved in China, again, it's enormous. It's even larger than the Pali scriptures. Again, hundreds and hundreds of volumes. And again, it's difficult to pick out what exactly was the word of the Buddha and what is not in those scriptures. And the same thing happens in Tibetan Buddhism again. Vast canon, you don't really know. So for this reason, what we have, and this is one of the beautiful things that has happened in our modern day and age, because we have a lot of language tools. This is what we call hermeneutical tools, by which you can decide, you can look at language and you can know roughly the stratification of a language, how it developed over time, what actually was going on. And according to that modern research, it's very clear. We know today very quite clearly what the Buddha said, or at least what he is most likely to have said. And we also know quite clearly the things that he didn't say. And of course, as many of you might know, the things that he said are roughly what is equivalent to the known as the four Nikayas in the Pali canon, and known as the four Agamas in the Chinese canon. And some of those suttas are also found in the Tibetan scriptures. And these are the things which are essentially known as the original Buddhism. And this is a very important point, because essentially over the last 2,500 years, people have been in the dark as to what was the word of the Buddha. They didn't really have the big overview that we have today. Because the world is so integrated today, we have a chance to compare all the suttas, to understand things using modern analytical tools to decide what is the true word of the Buddha. And this is a fairly recent development. Maybe it started happening already maybe a couple of hundred years ago, but it's only fairly recently that we have become very clear as to what the Buddha actually taught. So this is a wonderful thing, and it gives us a sense of certainty, maybe not absolute certainty, but very high probability that we have the word of the Buddha, and we can use that as our guidelines for deciding what we need to do when we take Buddhism to a new country like Australia. We know the things that are really important. We know the things that we can't throw out because they are essential. And we also know, by contrast, those things that are not necessarily essential. And you may perhaps ask, people often ask this question, well, what about these other scriptures? These things which modern scholars say are not the word of the Buddha, or probably not the word of the Buddha. And these are things like, for example, in the Pali scriptures, the Abhidhamma, things like the commentaries, the Visuddhimagga. And so how should we relate to these scriptures? Some people find a lot of inspiration in there. They find that these things are important. Can we just throw them out? And the way we should relate to these other scriptures, in my opinion, is we don't need to say that these things are wrong, or we don't even need to compare them to the suttas. What we rather should do is say, well, because it wasn't spoken by the Buddha, because we know that with a fair degree of certainty, there is uncertainty regarding these scriptures. We don't really know whether they're right or wrong. Perhaps you think that you can just take those scriptures and compare them to the word of the Buddha and then decide whether it's right or wrong. But sometimes that's incredibly complicated, because some of these scriptures, for the first of all, they're very long, they're very massive. It takes an enormous amount of learning to read through them. And secondly, they can be very complicated and very intricate. So I say it's difficult enough to get a good understanding of what the Buddha taught if we're not also going to get a good understanding of all these other things. So my view of these things is to put these other things to one side. They're not so important. And then focus on what we know as the Buddha Vachana, the word of the Buddha instead, and allow that to be the mainstay of our practice as Buddhists or people who are interested in Buddhism. And the same thing also goes for in the Chinese tradition, these enormous Chinese scriptures. You find all these things about bodhisattvas, about very different types of Buddhism from what we are used to in the Theravada Buddhist circles. And again, I say, and maybe some people would disagree with this, but in my opinion, leave those teachings aside. The Buddha didn't teach about bodhisattvas. The Buddha didn't teach about us becoming Buddhas. So there's no need for us to focus on that. If we do, we might just miss the point. And that is the danger of using the teachings of somebody else than the Buddha. It's very interesting, the Buddha actually said himself in the sutras, he said that in the future, one of the things that will lead to the decline of Buddhism is that people will start to listen to the teachings of what he called outsiders. Outsiders are the people outside of Buddhism. They were more interested in maybe in people who are maybe saints of other religions, people who are not Buddhists but have some smart things to say about certain things. And of course, it doesn't mean that everything they say is wrong, but the danger is always that you could be led a little bit astray by such teachings compared to what the Buddha said. The Buddha said people would be more interested in poets, because poets can often be good at giving sense to a beautiful sense of emotion, a beautiful sense of uplift. But again, it is possible that you might get led astray because you just don't know what these poets knew, what they were talking about. And the Buddha even said that in the future, people will listen to the disciples rather than listening to the Buddha. To disciples means, of course, all those monks and nuns, all those lay Buddhists who are disciples of the Buddha. But even they, the Buddha said, you don't know exactly what they're teaching. You don't know whether what they're saying is in accordance with the word of the Buddha. So again, he said, you should go back to the profound, deep word of the Buddha that is connected with emptiness. So this is the standard, I think, that is the most appropriate one to take. And it's a standard that the Buddha said we should take. Because as Buddhists or people who are interested in Buddhism, you have to assume that the Buddha was a wise man. You have to assume that the Buddha was enlightened, that he knew what he was talking about, that he had a profound experience of his night of enlightenment. If you don't assume that about the Buddha, if you think the Buddha didn't know, then there is no Buddhism. Buddhism relies on the fact that the Buddha was enlightened. But everybody else is uncertain. Everybody else we don't know. Even if somebody may appear very wise, we cannot be as sure as we have to be with the Buddha himself. So that is essentially where we should place our faith and where we should place our sense of what original Buddhism is all about. And for myself, as a Buddhist monk, I sometimes reflect to myself, well, what sort of teachings should I give? I sit up here and I get the chance to talk to lots of people, and I have to be very careful what I say. I don't want to misrepresent the Buddha. And I reflect to myself that, well, any authority that I have as a teacher, I get from the Buddha. If I sat here, if I didn't have a shaven head, I didn't wear the Buddha's robes, and I didn't have an alms bowl, and I wasn't part of the Sangha, nobody would take me seriously. They would just think, who is this guy? What does he want to say here? And fair enough, that's probably what they should say. They'd probably be right. It is because I'm a Buddhist monk and because I'm part of the Buddhist tradition that I get a certain authority as a Buddhist teacher. If I didn't have that, if I wasn't a Buddhist monk, I wouldn't have that authority. So, getting the authority from the Buddha, you have an obligation to make sure that you teach according to the word of the Buddha, that you say what he says. If you don't, then you are basically not living up to your obligation. He gives you the authority, then certainly you also have to act on those obligations to teach in the way that he taught. And this is what I try to do. I try to then, to the best of my ability, and of course these things are never going to be certain, and that's why you should always check everything I say against the word of the Buddha, never take it on trust, or maybe take it preliminary on trust, but not absolutely on trust. And then if you know that what I'm saying seems to make sense, well then it's okay. So that is original Buddhism. Now I want to move on to traditional Buddhism, to compare that to original Buddhism so we can actually tell the difference. And one of the important things to understand, in my opinion, is that traditional Buddhism started from the very beginning. The moment the Buddha came into the world and he started to teach, you had traditional Buddhism straight away. Because once you start expressing that enlightenment experience, once you start talking about it, once you start making institutions like the Sangha, like the lay community, once you start to act on this understanding, you get traditional Buddhism straight away. And that is very powerful to reflect on that. It's very important to understand that traditional Buddhism goes all the way back to the Buddha. His Buddhism also, it's not as if everything the Buddha did was a result of his enlightenment experience. Not everything was a result of that. A large part of it was a result of the society around him. The way words were used, the way the society was structured, all these kind of things were very important in the way the Buddha taught and the way he established his religion in the world. And to give you some examples of this, take for example my appearance as a Buddhist monk. Now the shaven head, for example, is not a Buddhist thing. This goes back before the Buddha. It's part of what is known as the Samana tradition in India. The Samanas were like the ascetic, the recluses at that time, the people who went forth from the home life. And so it was part of a tradition in India at that time. It wasn't an invention of the Buddha. Or the robes I wear, these robes are roughly the same as were also worn by ascetics and recluses at that time. So this again goes back to Indian society. It's not a Buddhist thing here. The alms bowl that we have as Buddhist monks, the going into the village and receiving food from people, all these things are part, all the external things that we do are part of an ancient tradition that goes back before the time of the Buddha. These are not necessarily Buddhist things as such. They are part of a much larger picture, part of the tradition of Indian society in those days. And that is important to understand, because what it means is that these things are not like absolutes that we necessarily have to follow absolutely here. They are things that maybe there is some scope for adjustments, for scope for looking at things differently here, because they have always been traditional from the very beginning here. And these robes that I'm wearing as a Buddhist monk or a Buddhist nun wears, not only are they part of the Samana tradition, the tradition of ascetics at the time of the Buddha, in those days even the lay people would wear clothes that were roughly like this. Lay people would wear a sarong, an underrobe. They would wear an upper robe, which was a little bit shorter than this one, but roughly like this. So in those days, there wasn't that much difference between the lay people and the monks. The main difference was that the monks had maybe a different color. They had simpler clothes. They didn't have anything fancy. They had the cloth was fairly ordinary. It wasn't too expensive, so it was very basic. But essentially, there wasn't that enormous difference between lay people and monks. So you can see again, it came from the society in those days. Of course, now a Buddhist monk, you stand out like a sore thumb. You look so different from everybody else. But originally, it wasn't like that. And sometimes you think, well, what if the Buddha had existed in the world today? Would he have used these sort of robes? And probably he might not have used these sort of robes. Maybe we would have been wearing trousers and jackets rather than wearing these kind of robes if the Buddha had been around today. I remember going back to Norway this is about almost a year ago now, and I usually meet up with some of my old university friends when I go there to talk to them about Buddhism and all these kind of things. And last time I was there, I talked to one of my friends about these robes. And I said, this is part of the very ancient tradition in India. It goes back a long, long way. And he said, well, those robes are really good. And he said that, well, you should look upon those robes as a case of branding. This is a really good brand you got there. Because you have this wonderful thing called the Buddhist religion, and you have this wonderful product that you want to get out into the world. And when you have a good product, it has to stand out. And here you have this great these wonderful robes that make you stand out like in this way here. So it is a case of, from a marketing point of view, it's a win-win situation, the good product, and it stands out like this. And I thought about that. That is actually quite a good point. And from that's of course, that's just one reason then why we shouldn't change the robes because actually there are some very good reasons for why we should keep them as they are. And so the branding factor, or the marketing factor is one thing. Another factor is tradition. And when I talk about the fact that we can change things, we can alter things, it doesn't mean that I think that traditions should be overthrown easily, that we should just throw things out because now in the modern world we need to do things differently. Far from it. Traditions are important because a tradition makes you part of something. You make part of the Buddhist history, part of a Buddhist, you have a sense of being a Buddhist in a different way and a part of a tradition. So traditions are important. And I never think we should throw those out lightly. My point is rather, and this is one reason why these robes are important, as part of a tradition. My point rather is that we need to understand the difference so that we can change if it is really required. So that is the first thing of traditional Buddhism, that actually the monastic appearance is traditional, is not really an essential part of the Buddhism. Another thing which is traditional, and this may surprise you also, is a lot of the institutions, a lot of those things that were laid down by the Buddha 2,500 years ago, and some of the very important things also are more traditional than original Buddhism. And one good example is the Uposatha ceremony, the Uposatha observance that most monastics and also lay people do. The Uposatha observance follows the ancient lunar calendar that was in use in India 2,500 years ago and is still in use in many countries, although the solar calendar is now by far the most important one. And it followed the lunar calendar in such a way that on the full moon and the new moon and also the half moons, people would often go to the monastery, they would listen to a talk, they would keep precepts and do all these things were part of their religious observance. These were called observance days, Uposatha days. And these observance days were not originally part of the Buddhist tradition. They also go back to a time before the Buddha. And the story in the Vinaya is the disciplinary code for the monastics, the monks and the nuns, tells the story of how this Uposatha came to be. And the story is roughly as follows. And this was the king of Magadha. Magadha is one of the ancient kingdoms in India, probably the most powerful kingdom at the time of the Buddha in northeast India. And this Magadha country had a king called Bimbisara. And this king Bimbisara very early on became a very close friend of the Buddha. He was a friend of the Buddha even before his enlightenment experience. So after the Buddha became enlightened, he taught King Bimbisara, and he gave him some teachings that were so powerful that King Bimbisara became a stream enterer upon listening to those teachings. And I find that so powerful, what a beautiful thing it is to have somebody like a king who is actually a stream enterer, somebody who understands the Dhamma very profoundly. It's a wonderful thing. Imagine if we had some politicians in our day who were stream enterers. Wouldn't that be wonderful? I'm not saying I'm not one of those who thinks all politicians are bad, but imagine having them as stream mentors. That would be really, really powerful. But anyway, this king, he was a stream mentor, and he realized that all these other ascetics of all these other sects, and at the time of the Buddha, there was enormous numbers of different types of religions, different philosophies, different systems of thought that was all across the north of India, people thinking in different ways, philosophizing about this, meditating in this way, practicing ascetic practices in that way. There was this kind of this enormous manifoldness when it came to religious practice. And King Bimbisara saw that many of these other religions, they would keep this Uposatha ceremony on the full moon nights and the new moon nights. And he saw how lay people were attracted to these ascetics and how they listened to their teachings on those full moon nights. So when he saw that, he went to the Buddha and said to the Buddha, he said, please, Bhante, why doesn't also the Buddhist monks do the same thing? Meet together on the Uposatha ceremony and then give talks to the lay Buddhist or whoever wants to come, so that they also can get inspiration in the Dhamma, get inspiration in these beautiful teachings. And of course the Buddha, he accepted that. He took that on board And he said, from now on, monks, you should meet together on the Uposatha ceremonies. And when you meet together, you should also give teachings to the lay people. So this is how the Uposatha ceremony came together. And then later on, the Buddha said that on the Uposatha night, the monks should chant, or not chant, I should say recite, because chanting again is a modern invention. You should recite the rules of the Patimokkha, which are the 227 rules that the monks keep, the 311 rules that the nuns keep. You should recite this as part of this observance on the Uposatha days. So this is how this Uposatha observance came into being. And this is one of the most fundamental parts of the Buddhist institution that we have to the present day. It is still today, you go to countries in Asia, you see all the Buddhists coming together on the Uposatha, listening to the Dhamma, keeping the 8 precepts, doing chanting together and all these things. It's one of the most important of all the Buddhist traditions that we have. And yet, it is not an original Buddhist thing. It came from something before that. It is, if you like, traditional Buddhism, rather than part of the core essence of Buddhism. And because of that, you can argue, if you wish, that there is some room there for changing this sort of tradition, if you wish. And it can be said that here in Australia, there has been some change already. If you look at how we do things here in Australia, everybody comes together to the Buddha Society here on a Friday night. We don't come together on the lunar nights because the lunar cycle is very impractical, but it doesn't always fit on the weekends. So here we follow the Australian way, which is coming together on the weekends, because it makes sense. And there is nothing, so this becomes like our observance night, if you like. When we come together, we meditate, we maybe reflect on the Dhamma, we try to understand a little bit more deeply what these teachings are about. So this is already one adaptation to Australian culture, or if you like, to modern culture, pretty much around the world. And there's nothing wrong with that, because it doesn't contradict anything that the Buddha said. In fact, we're just using that Uposatha ceremony in a way that fits with Australian society. Another of these institutions at the time which the Buddha laid down, which also was not part of the Buddhist tradition originally, that is what we call the Rains Retreat. The Rains Retreat is a time when all monastics, nuns and monks, take 3 months and stay put in one place. And for that time, we normally don't even come here to give talks in Olamara. We usually stay in the monastery. But this rains residence itself was not originally a Buddhist thing either. And the reason why this came into being was because the rainy season in India, when the monsoon comes out, is a very, very wet time of the year. And if you walk around at that time, all kind of living beings come out, all living beings, I think that's when they all insects tend to hatch and all these kind of things. And if you walk around a lot, you can kill a lot of living beings. And maybe you can also kill a lot of the greenery, the grass which comes out when the monsoon season comes. So people would complain. They would say, all these monks and nuns, they're wandering about, killing all these beings when they should stay put, just like these other ascetics in these other traditions. Because that existed already at the time. It was already part of the other traditions. And the Buddha then said to his monks and nuns, you too should settle down for the 3 months of the rainy season. You shouldn't wander about. You should settle down and have like a retreat for those 3 months. And that is a practice that we are still keeping at Bodhinyana Monastery, at the Masara Monastery to this day. We do those 3 months of the rainy season. And here in Australia it fits reasonably well because the rain in Australia is pretty much at the same time, or at least here in Perth it is, as it is in the monsoon season in India. So it's a fairly good fit with what happens in India. So that's a good thing here. But again, you can see, this is traditional Buddhism. It goes back to a time prior to the Buddha. And the Buddha used the existing traditions in India as part of also the Buddhist movement that started growing up at that time. So these are fairly straightforward things, but there are even deeper things in Buddhism, which are, if you like, traditional. And one of those things are some of the rules that the Buddha laid down for monastics. And there are, of course, as you know, as I mentioned before, there are 227 rules for the monks. In fact, there are many, many more rules than that, because the Vinaya can be expanded beyond those rules, and there's much more there. But some of those rules were laid down not because they are essentially Buddhist, but because lay people would come to the Buddha and say, "Bhante, Venerable Sir, these monks are doing all kinds of things which are contrary to the traditions in India. You must lay down a rule against these things." And a typical thing, a couple of typical examples are the Buddha laid down the rule that monks are not supposed to destroy plants, for example. This is one of those rules. And there isn't really anything in Buddhism which says that plants, that it's bad karma or it's wrong to kill plants. But according to the belief in India at the time, there was the belief that plants have one sense faculty. They can feel, so they can experience any destruction that is happening to them. And because of that, monastics are not allowed to the present day to kill plants, or even to break off a small branch, to pull a leaf, whatever it is, because of a belief that existed in India in those days. And the same thing with digging the ground. Digging the ground was also considered as injuring living beings, or injuring rather a sentient being which has one sense. The earth was considered as having one sense, the sense of touch. So monks should not kill, or rather dig the earth, because that would injure the earth. It would injure a one-sense living being. So again, you can see here how some of the rules that we have as monastics actually were laid down because of people complaining that it went against the traditions of society in those days. And of course, sometimes we find that people say, well, because the traditions in India were so different from what they are now, we should abolish all those rules, get rid of them, not worry about them because they're not really applicable to the modern day and age. We've got to be practical about these things, etc., etc. And I think that is really getting things completely wrong. That is not the right way of doing it. Because the rules are there, and the rules were laid down by the Buddha. Usually, if they were laid down by him, we have to assume that there is a certain importance to those rules. But what we can do, and this is what I think is what all monastics can do if they practice these things in the right way, is to realize that all rules of training, whether they are for monastics or for lay people, there's always a matter of interpretation there. How do you interpret these rules? How do you understand them? And if you ask two different monks or two different nuns about exactly the same rule, you're going to get slightly different responses, because it is impossible for everybody to interpret these rules in exactly the same way. You can't do that, basically. And that is where there's a little bit of leeway in our modern day and age. We can understand these rules slightly differently, just by changing the interpretation slightly. It doesn't have to be much, but keeping the rule while interpreting it in such a way that it fits reasonably well with our modern society here. And that is perfectly possible to do. And to give you some examples of that, for example, there are a number of rules in the Vinaya which talks about etiquette, how you're supposed to behave, how you're supposed to be. And as a monk, for example, at the time of the Buddha, you're not allowed, for example, to teach somebody the Dhamma who is wearing shoes. Why? Because wearing shoes was considered rude in the presence of somebody who's teaching the Dhamma. Now, this particular rule is only an offense according to the Vinaya if you break it in a disrespectful way, by being disrespectful to the Dhamma. So I say, this is my personal interpretation of this rule, I say, well, I'm not being disrespectful, but I say that in our present society, it is not usually considered to be disrespectful to wear shoes. And because it's not considered disrespectful, it is, if I break that rule, if I teach the Dhamma to somebody who's wearing shoes, I'm not being disrespectful to that rule, because times have changed. And that is one way of interpreting the rules in such a way that they fit with our modern society without breaking the spirit of the rule, without even breaking the letter of the rule. It's just a matter of looking at it in a slightly different way. And if you do that, And some of the minor rules that don't really fit in with our present day of looking at things are not really such a problem after all. And you will see, like Ajahn Brahm, for example, he may sometimes go and give a lecture at a university. He will stand in a low place, and a lot of people will be sitting high up in the lecture theatre. And that would be wrong according to ancient Buddhism. You're not supposed to teach the Dhamma to somebody who is sitting down if you are standing. You're not supposed to teach the Dhamma to somebody who is higher than you if you are in the low place. But again, the fact is that these rules, because they only are an offense if you are disrespectful, you can say, well, this is the West, this is Australia, things are different here, we don't look at these things in the same way, so it is acceptable to do this in this particular situation. And that is how you can have a certain amount of flexibility in this rule. Again, is understanding that there is a certain amount of tradition here, and these things are not absolute things that are 100% clear, cannot deviate from them. There is a flexibility there. Now the last thing, which is also part of traditional Buddhism at the time of the Buddha, was the way the Buddha actually taught the Dhamma. And this is where it starts to get much more complicated. Because you have to remember that the Buddha, his teachings, not only were the result of his enlightenment experience, they were also a result of the vocabulary, the kind of teachings that existed at the time in India. He had to use the words that were already in common parlance in those days. All the words that we have today that we use in the Pali language are words that were used at the time in India. Arahants, Aryas, Samadhi, all Sati, all these things come from the Indian language. And the Buddha took those words and then he used them very often in a different way to emphasize the Buddhist way of looking at these things. And of course later on the Buddha said that when you go out, he said to the monks, when you go out and teach others, you shouldn't adhere strictly to one particular way of speaking. You should allow for the differences around the world, around the country of India, and teach in accordance with how the local people speak. The Dhamma should not be something which is elevated into something which is completely, which is like a foreign language for people, like a Latin kind of thing. It should be something which can be understood by people. And this is a very important principle, because what it means that in this day and age, the Dhamma should be made plain in the English language. It should be made plain in any language, basically, so people can read and understand it in their own mother tongue. And I know for myself how important it is to understand something in your mother tongue, because my mother tongue is not English, obviously, it's Norwegian. And I know that when I read the Dhamma in Norwegian, I feel there's a sense of closeness to the Dhamma, which is you don't have when you read it in a foreign language. I mean, I've been living in English-speaking countries now so long, it doesn't make that much difference to me anymore, but it still makes a little bit of difference. I know for those people whose if you read Pali, for example, then you're reading in language that is very foreign to you, and then it doesn't have the same emotional impact as when you read it in your own language. And also you understand, of course, much better what is going on. So this is one of the important things, that we actually do translate, we do teach these things in the vernacular language of the place where you are at. This is, I think, very important. So that is one of the results, again, of the tradition being a tradition rather than some absolute truth. Sometimes you can wonder, sometimes you can read some of the commentarial works of Buddhism, and they say that Pali is like a sacred language. It is the language which a baby, if it grows up and it doesn't learn any other language, it will speak Pali automatically. That is one of the things it says in some of these commentarial works. And of course, to me, I think it is. It's funny because somebody obviously must have believed that, but it is so strange to my modern way of thinking that people actually could believe this. And it really goes against the way the Buddha taught. And we have to remember that these things are traditions which can be adapted, this is what the Buddha himself said, to our modern setting. And not only the language he used was part of the tradition in those days, even some of the teachings he used were part of the tradition of India in those days. For example, the Buddha had, of course, some of his most profound teachings are the teachings of non-self. And those teachings were in direct contrast to the teachings of Brahmanism, of Hinduism in those days. Because Hinduism taught about a universal self, a universal consciousness. Whereas the Buddha said, well, actually, my awakening experience tells me there is no such thing here. So for that reason, you find in the word of the Buddha that he specifically talks about these beliefs that the Brahmanas had in those days. And he addresses those beliefs directly. So you find the teachings of other teachers in there because they are addressed by the Buddha. And of course, in exactly the same way in today's world, we have to address the issues which are the important issues for us in exactly the same way. The idea of a universal kind of God or universal soul or universal consciousness is of course important even now. But of course also we have to address other religions. We have to talk about Buddhism versus Christianity versus Islam. What are the differences? What are the similarities? We have to address all the questions that our modern world throws up for us. Things like stem cell research, euthanasia, abortion, all these kind of things. We have to address these issues because they are important in our day and age. And we have to have Buddhist answers. This is the only way that Buddhism is going to be relevant in our society. We have to address all these issues. That is exactly what the Buddha was doing. He was addressing the issues of his days, in particular the issues that had to do with profound religious teachings. So what I'm saying here is basically that the traditional Buddhism is something which goes a long, long way back, all the way back to the time of the Buddha itself. And of course, after the Buddha passed away, Buddhism became even more traditional as we moved away from the Buddha. As time went on, the Buddhist teachings, the way it appeared in the world, the way it was taught, the teachings that were available, all these things became more and more, started to change, started to multiply into many various kinds of teachings. And of course it moved on to different countries. It went to China, it went to Sri Lanka first of all, and it went to China, it went to Central Asia, it went to Burma and Thailand, and all these different countries. And wherever it went, it took on some of the characteristics of the local community. Just like it took on the characteristics in ancient India when the Buddha first made these discoveries. So, what are some of these characteristics, just briefly? And one very good example is Buddhism in China. I'm no expert on this, but I certainly can tell you about some of the changes that happened when Buddhism went to China, because it definitely took on some of the characteristics of Chinese society. And you will see that one example, for example, is the robes they wear in China. They're very different from the robes we wear in Southeast Asia, which are these kind of robes. Not only China, but in most of East Asia, they wore a different kind of robes. And of course, I think that must have been a response to the climate conditions in the north of China, in particular, where it was very cold during the winter, and it was very difficult to wear these kind of robes when it was snowing, when it was minus 10 or 20 degrees or whatever. You needed something more. And that's why they moved on to using trousers, using jackets. If you look at these Mahayana monks, they still stand out. They're still monks because they look very different from ordinary people. But they have moved on, and they have a different set of robes than what we have in Southeast Asia and we have at Bodhinyana Monastery. And sometimes people think, oh, these are the wrong robes. We can't really use those robes over there. These are the right ones. But in my understanding of the Vinaya, my understanding of the Buddha's teachings, is that the Buddha actually is quite flexible. And there isn't any absolute standard. You have to use any particular robes. And as I mentioned before, these robes themselves were part of the tradition in India at the time. It wasn't something the Buddha laid down as particularly Buddhist. So I say, it is okay. We can accept the kind of robes that are worn in places like China, Korea, Vietnam, etc. It's all right. They're not really all that different from what we are wearing here. Another such change that happened in China was you will see some of the architecture in China is very different to what you find in other countries. In particular, you have the Chinese pagodas, these multi-story buildings with lots and lots of stories going up. Now these pagodas in China originally were the same thing as the stupas in ancient India. The stupas in ancient India were like a burial mound where you would put in the ashes or the relics of a saint, and initially they were just a mound of earth, nothing more, maybe with a few bricks inside. And eventually they become more elaborate. They become like these famous stupas in Sanchi in north of India, very famous stupas which are an important site of pilgrimage to this particular day. But again, they were basically just a mound, a big kind of dome, maybe many meters tall, but still just a dome. And then maybe a railing around it, a few gateways, etc., and some parasols on top. But that was essentially what it was. But in China, it became a pagoda, this multi-story building, a very kind of fancy structure compared to the simple buildings of India. And again, that must have been under the influence of Chinese culture at the time. You can see the change there happening, but the original thing actually came from India. Another aspect of Chinese culture which affected Buddhism as it came to India is it became more hierarchical. And I'm no expert, but I take it that may have something to do with the Confucian values of China, which tends to be maybe more hierarchical. And for that reason, the Zen, which arose in China, always had patriarchs. A patriarch was like the man or the monk on top of the pyramid, of the Sangha, of the Chan or the Zen tradition in India. And again, that came from, I think, the Chinese society, which was more structured than probably Indian society was. Then you had things like meat eating. Meat eating was forbidden in China. And sometimes people think that these things actually are part of the monastic rules in China. But actually it seems that meat eating was banned in China, not because of any monastic thing, but it was the emperor of China that decided that monks and nuns should not be eating meat. Again, Chinese culture, which is mixing here with Buddhism to form a Chinese variety of Buddhism. And of course, I think that this is actually a good thing that this is happening. Because if monks and nuns were not allowed to wear warm clothes in China, Buddhism probably would never survive. If it wasn't allowed to adapt in certain ways to the Chinese society, then probably it wouldn't survive because it wouldn't get accepted by the Chinese society. So it's a good thing that Buddhism adapts in these ways to the local culture. But there is a downside with adaptation. And the downside is when you start to go against the original Buddhism, the real teachings of the Buddha. And that is what you see happening in India already soon after the Buddha. You see it also happening in China because you see that many of the suttas and things that were accepted in China, because a lot of the things that were taken from India into China came at a fairly late stage. It came maybe 5, 6, 7, 800 years after the Buddha. Over a very long period of time it was taken into China. And because of that, many of the teachings that became the most important in China were not necessarily the most fundamental teachings that were given by the Buddha himself, but other teachings became more prominent. Things like the Bodhisattva path, things like Pure Land Buddhism, and these kind of things. And because of that, I feel that is a danger. That is where I would say that, and this is a good example for us in Australia to think about when we bring Buddhism into Australia, to be careful of these sort of things and be very clued up, so to speak, on what actually is the core teachings of the Buddha. Otherwise, you might be led astray. And of course, I'm not saying here that all of Buddhism in China is wrong or anything. There's a vast variety of Buddhisms over there, and some people who obviously practice very correctly in a very right way. But still, I feel there is a danger when you start to move away and you focus too much on those things which are not the word of the Buddha. And the same thing happened in India itself, of course, as well as time went by. There was a greater and greater focus on different teachings, etc. And not only in India, but also in Southeast Asia, you find the same thing. There was a development over time. So not only in China, in Southeast Asia as well. And some of the things you find in Southeast Asia are Well, first of all, the Southeast Asia is much closer to India, so the culture is much closer to Indian culture. But even there you find differences from the way things were done in India. For example, if you go to Thailand, you find that the monastic tradition there is run in a different way from the way it was done in India. In Thailand, the abbot of a monastery has a very, very strong position, and maybe that, again, is a result of the Thai idea of a more structured society, a bit more hierarchical, perhaps, than the Indian society. Again, Thai culture has influenced the way Buddhism is done in Thailand, although it is much closer to the Indian original in many ways, in terms of robes, for example. But also in Southeast Asia, you have the same problem with scriptures. You have scriptures that were taken in later on, and which even today are regarded by many as very important. And again, I say, if we want in Australia, we can learn something from this. We can learn that those scriptures that are not the word of the Buddha, that we know today with great certainty are not, we can put those to one side, and we can focus on those things which are the root and the original form of Buddhism. So just to summarize what I've been saying today, and just to draw some conclusions for how we should maybe approach this whole business here in Australia. First of all, I again want to say that tradition is not wrong in its own right. Tradition is simply how Buddhism is practiced at any particular point in time and at any particular place. And tradition is always different from country to country. It always adapts according to the local situations. And it's good that it adapts. It's right, it should adapt, because this is the only way that it can take root in a firm and strong way in any particular society. So we should do the same in Australia. We shouldn't be afraid when something is really important. We shouldn't be afraid of adapting things. We don't have to take things wholesale on board according to any particular existing tradition. We can adapt things when we see it is right. And the criteria that we should use for that adaptation is one. We should always remind ourselves, what did the Buddha say? And we should make sure that anything we do is in accordance with the teachings, the original Buddhism, the experience the Buddha had under the Enlightenment tree. That is very important. If we don't do that, we risk throwing out the baby with the bathwater. We don't want to do that. We want to keep that baby. That baby is what Buddhism is all about. So we have to make sure we don't throw the baby out. And the second criteria we should use, having established what the word of the Buddha is, we should ask ourselves, well, what are the demands that Australian society places on us as Buddhists? And if those demands that are placed upon us as Buddhists by Australian society, if they match with what the Buddha said, if those two things come together, then I say that is the right time to adapt the tradition that we have to whatever that is when they come together, the word of the Buddha and the demands of our local society. That's when adaptation should happen. In fact, not only should happen, I would almost say it must happen, because in those circumstances, if we don't adapt in those circumstances, we are not going to have a Buddhism which survives in Australia in the long run. Eventually it will be rejected by Australian society because it's not close enough to the norms of Australia, not close enough to the norms of people living here. So then we should adapt to the society which is here. But we shouldn't do this with a light heart. We should make sure that when we do this, that we're doing the right thing, that it really is important, and that it actually is something which will benefit Buddhism in the long run. So let me give you some examples, because examples always clarify things. First of all, some examples of the wrong way of adaptation. And sometimes you can read like people writing about Buddhism, and they're saying that, well, in our modern day and age, you cannot believe in things like rebirth, so out with rebirth, and then we have this Buddhism without rebirth. So the right thing we should do, however, is not just have an opinion about whether rebirth is right or wrong. What we should do, according to the criteria I've just laid out, we should go back and see, what did the Buddha say about rebirth? Did the Buddha say that there is rebirth, or did he say there isn't rebirth? And that should be the starting point for whether we should accept or reject this idea of rebirth. And of course, for those of you who have heard me speaking here before, I always say that rebirth is a fundamental part of the Buddhist teachings. You take it out, you don't have Buddhism anymore, you got something completely different. It is so important, it is so central that if you take it out, if anybody rejects rebirth out of hand, I say they cannot really be Buddhist anymore. At the very least, you have to have an open mind about these things. So for me, that is the wrong way to go about reforming or adapting Buddhism, is to throw out those principles which are central to the Buddha's teachings. Another mistaken way is to take all the rules the Buddha laid down for the monastics and for the lay people and say these rules, as I mentioned before, are no longer relevant for the modern society, so throw them out wholesale and let us make up our own rules, whatever we feel is appropriate. Again, it's the wrong way, because the Buddha laid down these rules, and most of these rules are very important, and most of these rules have a function that is very important, and instead of throwing them out, we can instead allow ourselves to just look at these rules and interpret them in such a way that they are acceptable to our modern world, within the guidelines of the rule, but not in a very necessarily strict and traditional way of interpreting them. So these are two examples of the way we shouldn't practice, in my opinion. Of course, other people might disagree with that, but still, that is the way I look at it. So what is an example of the kind of reform that we should be doing in Australia? And of course, you may know what I'm getting at now. And of course, the kind of reform that we should be doing is the sort of thing that we did here at the Buddhist Society about just over 5 months ago, on October the 22nd, when we ordained bhikkhunis here, actually at Bodhinyana Monastery. That is the kind of reform we should be doing as Buddhists here in Australia. Why? Because the Buddha laid down the female ordination, full ordination for women. The Buddha laid it down. There is no real reason for rejecting female ordination, full ordination. The second reason is that, as far as I can understand, it is a demand in most modern societies, including Australian society, that we should have that equality of opportunity between men and women. It is considered just a matter of ethics. It's considered a matter of what is right and wrong in our part of the world. So there is a demand for that in our Australian society and in all modern societies, really. So this is a classic case where the demands of the modern society and the original teachings of the Buddha fall in line with each other. And then we should adapt, we should reform, we should change things so that they are in line with those two criteria.